Who are you? And where are you going? What do you want?
Hello and welcome to Business Lessons from the Military. I'm your host, Kevin Bemmel, and we're here every Tuesday at 10 a.m. Pacific time to talk about military history, doctrine, and the practices of great military leaders, all by way of distilling lessons that we can use in our business and professional lives. So this show is broadcasting on December 3rd, 2024, which is 4 days before Pearl Harbor Day, December 7th. And Pearl Harbor happened, 59 plus 24, so 79, 83 years ago this week. And it was one of, if not the most devastating defeat that the United States Navy ever suffered. And so I'm going to talk about what happened on Pearl Harbor and what lessons can be learned from it that we can use in our own lives, and in particular in our business and professional lives. So as I mentioned a moment ago, the attack on Pearl Harbor took place on December 7th, 1941. It was a strike by the Imperial Japanese Navy and Air Service on the American naval base at Pearl Harbor in Honolulu, Hawaii. It was an early morning attack, and essentially the Japanese fleet, including, I believe it was 4 aircraft carriers, approached Hawaii from the north, and they had made sort of a big northern arc to hopefully stay unrecognized that they were approaching Pearl Harbor, which they were successful in doing. It was a surprise attack. And they launched over 350 aircraft, and those included dive bombers, torpedo bombers, and they bombed Pearl Harbor. And the idea behind the attack was it was actually more strategic than anything else. So the Japanese military hoped that by completing this devastating attack on the American fleet and forces in Pearl Harbor, that it would cause the United States to basically stay out of the war, to create a treaty with Japan, agreeing to let Japan keep the territorial gains they had made in the Western Pacific, and also to stop the various embargoes that the United States had imposed against Japan on things like oil and raw materials and such, of which Japan had none domestically in the Japanese islands, and hence their efforts to take over territory in places like Indonesia and such, where they had access to oil and rubber and other raw materials that they needed for their expansion. So the overall idea of Imperial Japan was to create something called the East Asian co-prosperity sphere of influence, and the idea was sort of Asia for Asians, if you will, and so by attempting to knock the United States out of the war, by not even coming into it, the Japanese were hopeful of gaining victory in the Pacific. The main targets of the attack were the capital ships of the United States Navy, primarily the battleships and the aircraft carriers that were based at Pearl Harbor. And the Japanese prepared quite thoroughly for this mission by practicing these, coming in very low and targeting the ships with torpedoes and bombs, etc. And indeed, the attack was overall quite successful. So 2,400 Americans were killed, both military and civilian. Another nearly 1,200 were wounded. 8 battleships were destroyed or damaged, including the USS Arizona, which remains as a memorial to the dead at Pearl Harbor. When I was in the Navy, we made port calls in Pearl Harbor several times, and one of them I went and visited the Arizona Memorial. It's quite an awe-inspiring thing to do. The attack also destroyed or damaged over 300 aircraft, and there were basically two waves in the attack, and then the Japanese planes flew back to their ships, and that was kind of that. So the immediate impact of the attack at Pearl Harbor was the next day, December 8th, President Franklin Delano Roosevelt spoke to Congress and called for a declaration of war against not just Japan, but the entire Axis, including Nazi Germany. And the declaration of war was almost unanimous. There was one congresswoman who voted against it. And so in that respect, Pearl Harbor had the opposite effect of what Japan had hoped, because the United States ended up entering the war. And it gave FDR a very firm rationale for finally having the United States engage completely in World War II, because prior to that, the United States had been supplying all kinds of materiel to, in particular, the British, and they were sharing intelligence. So the United States was definitely supporting the Allies. We were providing convoy escorts in the North Atlantic, and there was a pretty profound tilt toward the Allies, although there were a number of well-known people in the United States that definitely had sympathy with the Axis, including Charles Lindbergh, and Henry Ford. But in the end, as you probably know, the United States entered World War II on the side of the Allies, and was instrumental in the Allies prevailing. So there were a number of non-strategic impacts, if you will, as a result of the Pearl Harbor attack. And one is, in the short term, it did indeed impede the United States Navy's ability to prosecute the war in the Pacific theater. So, as I mentioned before, 8 battleships were damaged or sunk, including the USS Arizona and the USS Oklahoma, complete losses. However, the other battleships were eventually refloated and repaired. Fortunately for the United States, none of the aircraft carriers were in port when the attack came. And so they all survived the attack, completely operational. Now, as it turned out, this was one of the most important shortcomings of the attack, because there was a fight going on in the United States Navy at the time between those admirals who in a way, sort of cherished the old Navy that was based on firepower, battleships with ever larger guns, and that sort of thing, and the newer Navy that saw naval air power as being the dominant force for the future. So by having so many battleships damaged or destroyed, the United States Navy had no choice but to essentially organize its fleets around aircraft carriers, and this hastened the transition and the dominance of naval air power that exists to this day. So, although in World War II, for example, aircraft carriers did not sail alone. They went with escort vessels, cruisers, destroyers, etc., oilers, that sort of thing. Today, in fact, aircraft carriers don't need those support ships either for support functions or for defense functions. In fact, the aircraft carrier provides defense for the other ships. So I can tell you from my own career, when I was deployed in 2011 and the earthquake and tsunami hit Japan, so we were tasked, we being the USS Ronald Reagan, we were tasked with immediately sailing to Japan. And because we could sail faster than our other so-called escort vessels, or the other ships in our strike group, we left them behind, and we sailed lickety split across the Pacific to Japan on our own. And the reality is, the air wing, of which I was a part of the air wing. And the air wing was assigned to the Reagan, but the air wing provided not only the power projection capability, but also the defensive capability for the ship. So that's just the reality of how aircraft carriers are today. But that's a result of the transition that took place during World War II, where the capital ship Navy, the battleship and cruiser supporting admirals, lost out to those who saw air power as being the future of the Navy. So that was a sort of maybe operational feature of the attack. It forced the Navy to update its doctrine, if you will. There were over 300 aircraft destroyed or damaged during the attack. And initially, this did hamper offensive capabilities, although the patrol aircraft, for the most part, survived. And so the Navy and the Army Air Forces were able to keep up reconnaissance flights and such. And so, but the destruction of so many aircraft spurred the very fast gearing up of industrial capacity, so that the aircraft that were lost could not only be replaced, but both naval and Army and Marine Corps air forces could all be augmented to a wartime footing. As well, the killing of 2,400 people, like I said, both military and civilian, as well as the wounding of almost 1,200 more, it absolutely shocked the nation. However, instead of demoralizing Americans, it really galvanized American public opinion against Japan and in favor of the United States taking an active part in World War II on the side of the Allies. So one of the features of Pearl Harbor was from a diplomatic standpoint, the Japanese ambassador in Washington, D.C., was continuing to have discussions with Secretary of State Cordell Hull up until essentially up until the attack, this, as it was described, sneak attack. And Americans in general felt that Japan had acted in bad faith by not declaring war in advance, and using this sort of sneak attack as a way to um, gain an advantage on the United States. And so again, contrary to what the Japanese military leaders thought, um, uh, that Pearl Harbor would sort of rock America back on her heels. Quite to the contrary, it ended up really motivating Americans to fight, and recruiting stations starting on December 8th were overwhelmed with young men wanting to sign up to fight World War II, to fight the Japs in the language of the day. And there's a famous radio announcer whose name I'm going up on, but he would say, everybody today wants to take a crack at the Japs, meaning young men wanted to enlist in the Navy, the Army, and the Marine Corps, the Army Air Forces, in order to go and fight Japan. And of course, not just Japan at that point, Nazi Germany as well. And so those were some of the short-term results. The longer-term results were sort of a continual gearing up of ever greater industrial production. So right after World War II, President Roosevelt called on manufacturers, I forget the exact numbers, but like 50,000 planes by the end of 1942, and these big, huge numbers that the goals were not achieved. However, there was an inpouring of people into the defense industry, and round-the-clock shifts, and industrial production in the United States absolutely skyrocketed. In the language of the times, the United States became the great arsenal of democracy. So we produced tanks, jeeps, aircraft, ships, rifles, everything you can imagine in terms of war materiel that was sufficient not only for the American military, but also for the British military, the Russian military, whom we supplied, and really, most of the materiel that was used for the Allies to eventually win World War II came from the United States. For example, the Sherman tank was used throughout Allied militaries. The British were producing tanks, as were the Russians. However, the Sherman tank was produced in such huge numbers that even though the tanks produced by Nazi Germany were actually far superior in many cases. For example, the Tiger tank was a much better tank than the Sherman, but Germany could just not come even close to the amount of industrial production of the Tiger tanks that the U.S. did of the Sherman tanks, and in a way, the American industrial capacity just overwhelmed the Axis, both Germany and Japan. So, on the Japanese side, the United States waged submarine warfare against Japanese shipping, and the Japanese were just not able to keep up with their losses in merchant shipping, nor were they able to keep up in their losses of aircraft, of naval ships, and so there was a long-term industrial mobilization that took place, such that by the middle of 1942, the Navy was replacing ships and aircraft at an absolutely unprecedented rate. They surpassing their losses and growing and growing and growing and on until the end of World War II in 1945. So There was also, as I mentioned, a strategic shift. Initially, it was forced on the Navy because the battleships just were not available. But then at the Battle of Midway in 1942, if memory serves, I want to say October of 1942, this was a decisive battle between American aircraft carriers and Japanese aircraft carriers, in which the U.S. Navy absolutely decimated the Japanese Navy. Three of the four Japanese aircraft carriers, I think, were sunk, or maybe it was 4 out of 4. The United States did lose two of their carriers, but it was a decisive win for not just the United States Navy, but for the United States Navy air arm. And it showed conclusively that the future of the Navy was with aircraft carriers. And so thereafter, when battleships did take place, they were there to do things like bombardment prior to amphibious operations and that sort of thing. They were not the primary force of the United States Navy. So, and cruisers and destroyers became the sort of picket ships and provided defense to aircraft carriers, et cetera. But they were relegated to that position as opposed to a purely offensive position that they had in the older Navy. And so that became, as I mentioned earlier, a long-term shift in the U.S. Navy. It's interesting to note, as a side note, that there are discussions going on in naval forums over the last few years that are calling into question whether the United States should still be investing the kind of money it invests in aircraft carriers. So the last U.S. carrier launched, the USS Gerald Ford, cost, I believe it was $1 billion plus, for one ship, right? There's a lot of advanced technology on the ship that means it requires a much smaller crew than previous aircraft carriers. But the idea of having so much assets, financial and people and otherwise, concentrated in one ship that, if a missile gets through, could sink it. There are people questioning whether in today's world, given the kind of military technology that exists, things like the ability to potentially swarm drones at an aircraft carrier and overwhelm its defenses, that it makes sense to continue with that. It's not clear to me how that's going to play out, but like I said, those discussions are happening. So the other both short-term trending into a longer-term trend was just the whole outlook of Americans toward the war, the unity, the resolve. In general, Americans are not up for long wars, and yet, in general, the United States stayed committed to prosecuting World War II for almost 4 years. We entered the war in December of 1941. The war in Europe ended in May of 1945, and in Japan in September of 1945. So, like I say, almost 4 years, and remained fairly unified throughout the war. Now, there were people who, were not at all happy about World War II being fought. There were people who got war fatigue as World War II continued. But overall, America stayed very unified in the prosecution of World War II. And part of that came from this idea of remember Pearl Harbor, remember the perfidy of the Imperial Japanese Navy, etc. And so Americans were, on the one hand, remained committed to industrial production, agricultural production, and such that was necessary in order to fight the war. They remained committed to sending ever more men and to a lesser extent women into the military to pursue the fight. Women were not in combat back then, but there were roughly 500,000 American service members lost their lives in World War II. That was a huge number, only surpassed by the losses of the American Civil War. And there was probably not a family in the country that either hadn't had a father or son killed, or was, friends with a family who had had a father and son killed. Nonetheless, Americans in general stayed committed to the war. So these were the trends that came out of the battle, and the reality is that the United States recovered pretty quickly from Pearl Harbor. It was not the devastating victory. It was a devastating loss for the United States, but not at the level that the Imperial Japanese military hoped it would be. And that was there were several reasons for that. One I mentioned already is the aircraft carriers were not there that day, and so they remained to fight another day. But as important and often not talked about is the Japanese attackers at Pearl Harbor failed to destroy the tank farms that held fuel and lubricants that were necessary to fuel the ships so that they could sail. This was before the days of nuclear-powered carriers, and so fuel oil was necessary to power the ships. So those tanks were left undamaged. As important, or maybe even more important, is the dry docks and other repair facilities remained essentially undamaged as well. And so the ability of the United States Navy to refloat ships, get them into dry dock, get them prepared, was very little harmed by the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor. And so starting on December 8th, that process of what's the word I'm looking for? Anyway, of fixing the ships and repairing them and getting them ready to fight started. And there was a great deal. And the other thing that that Pearl Harbor wasn't able to do was to destroy the ingenuity of those people working on the effort to refloat ships and get them ready to fight again. And so from the get-go, because of the kind of unity and spirit that was engendered in Americans as a result of the Pearl Harbor attack, the United States Navy very quickly recovered from what was no doubt a devastating defeat, but not a cataclysmic one in the sense of forcing the United States to be unable to fight the war. And so the United States went on to the island hopping strategy that eventually ended up with the surrender of the Japanese after the dropping of the 2 atomic bombs. And so despite the defeat, the United States military and the United States in general came back stronger than ever, more strategically capable, more operationally and tactically capable. And so in terms of an overall lesson for our business and professional lives, I think that's the number one lesson to take away, that we can suffer, a devastating defeat, but that doesn't have to put us out of, I don't call war a game, but business is kind of a game. And so we don't have to let a devastating defeat put us out of business. Okay, we can use it to inspire our team, inspire our people to a renewal, to a reexamination, to make the strategic, operational, and tactical shifts that need to be made to go on, not just to get back to where we were with our businesses or professional practices, but to go beyond that. And I can tell you from my own experience, so I started in business in 1986 for the first time, and I had a real estate company. For those of you who watch the show, you know that. And the very end of the 1980s, 89 through 91, were a terrible, terrible time for real estate in the United States. And I held on to my business by just the barest of margins. That I didn't have to declare bankruptcy was only because, frankly, I was just too stubborn to do it. But it was an extremely tough time. And yet, by rebuilding out of that time, and I had to let go of all of my staff because I couldn't afford them, and it really pained me because most of my staff were family members. So I had to make painful decisions to do in order to survive. But when I was able to rebuild my business, and it took me a good couple of years to do so, I ended up going on and becoming much more successful than I had ever been before. And part of why I became more successful was, for example, I did not load up on a huge number of employees and burden the business with a lot of salaries. Instead, I started looking for technological solutions to help me, and usually the one other person I had helping me on a part-time basis, be able to get more done in more efficiently. And that was number one. And number two, instead of hiring people in-house, I looked for ways to essentially contract out what I needed done, so I wasn't burdened with salaries and benefits and all that kind of thing. And I could be more flexible in terms of the expense I needed to incur for for labor, for people to be members of my team, because they weren't in house. They essentially had their own businesses, and so we came together as a team when we needed to, and otherwise we were off doing other things. So the the devastation I suffered business wise in the very late 80s and early 90s forced me also to examine my strategy, operations, and tactics, and figure out ways to do it more efficiently, less costly. I embraced things like online banking, which was just beginning to happen at the time. It saved money on postage. It saved time. I didn't have to print checks and mail them out and all that kind of stuff. And all kinds of technological solutions, in order to make my business more efficient. So that's the large lesson from learning from defeat. In this case, I'm using Pearl Harbor as the example. I have 5 other lessons that I want to pass on to you that apply to our business lives. So one of them is we need to anticipate and address emerging threats. And the reality is that, and there's been tons of discussion about Pearl Harbor over the decades. At the time, and even till now, there are people who say that Roosevelt knew that the Japanese were going to attack Pearl Harbor, and he purposely didn't notify Admiral Husband Kimmel and General Short about it because he wanted the devastating attack in order to motivate Americans to get involved. I've read extensively on this. I don't buy that theory. However, it was the case that American communications systems were not at all adequate to the task. Event, the notifications or the information that was being passed to Pearl Harbor in some cases was being done by, Western Union, which is ridiculous. I mean, that's a completely, essentially open source way of transmitting messages. And so the United States just was not at all anticipating threats, and they were not addressing emerging threats well enough. And so in business, we need to be on a consistent basis examining our competitors, examining the marketplace in which we're operating, and looking at how is that likely to affect our businesses. So I was in a networking meeting this morning with a group of military veterans, and we were discussing the topic of AI, or what's really better known as large language models. And there were several of us there who are actively looking at how AI can improve our businesses, while others are almost like deer in the headlights. I hear about this. I have no idea what to do with it. I'm afraid that I'm going to lose my businesses. There was one fellow there who was saying that, AI is going to cause massive losses of jobs in certain areas. And then there were a couple of us who were saying, yes, but those people whose jobs stand to be lost should be thinking now about retraining in order to maintain the systems, the robots and the AI systems, which is a much more lucrative thing to do than the kind of jobs that AI could replace. And so these are the kinds of strategic, operational, and tactical matters we need to be looking at so we can anticipate and address emerging threats. They can be market threats. They could be things like cybersecurity threats. All of these, we need to assess the vulnerabilities of our businesses and practices and start looking now at how to address them, rather than waiting for some sort of cataclysmic event to happen that would really, put us, very far behind. Okay, next, preparedness and adaptability. So, one of the things that that Pearl Harbor showed was the United States was really not prepared at all for this kind of surprise aerial attack. While there were patrols set out and radar did exist, the radar was only active, I think, for a couple of hours in the morning or something like that. And so, the idea that was adequate to protecting what was, after all, probably the most important strategic military asset in the Pacific Ocean, in retrospect, was very, very foolish. And so we need to also take a look at where can we be directly attacked, and how can we prepare. What do we need to have in place in order to fend off that attack and prevent, or at least significantly reduce losses in business, losses in key personnel? So, for example, I'll give you one from my practice as a professional fiduciary. I was having this conversation with my guest on my show yesterday, and that is, if you own a company, how are you going to prepare for the loss of a charismatic founder owner of the business? so that the business doesn't fall apart when that person passes away. So, a lot of people I don't know about a lot of people, but people make the mistake of thinking that longtime employees are very dedicated to a business, and even people who've been working with the founder for years and decades, and they're going to stay on because they've been there so long. That is not necessarily the case. So if continuity of employees is important for the survival of a business, and the business is being run by a founder, especially a charismatic founder, so the factors need to be examined and put into place that will encourage these people to stay. Otherwise, when the founder dies, they may abandon the company because it turns out they were only there because they had the chance to work with this individual who's now gone. Indeed, they don't particularly like the business that they're involved in, or they don't feel they're being compensated well enough, but in deference to the relationship they had with the founder, they stayed for a long time. But now that he's gone, they all leave the company, and now there's nobody there left to mind the store, as they say. So preparedness and adaptability are things that we need to look at, and clearly Pearl Harbor is an example of lack of preparedness. Although I would say after the fact, the Navy adapted pretty well, but better to build in adaptability rather than to have to create it on the fly, as was the case after Pearl Harbor. Okay, next is the value of effective communication and coordination, and this was one of the poorest aspects that both led to the Pearl Harbor debacle, as well as exacerbated the losses. So I spoke about how communication between senior military leadership in Washington, D.C. and leadership in Pearl Harbor was not good. A lot of the communication was not at all clear. Now, messages just didn't transmit as fast as back then as they do today. But clarity of communication is as important as timeliness of communication, and neither one of those were present at Pearl Harbor as well. So there was a flight of, I believe it was B-17 bombers that was coming from the mainland to Hawaii. They had been lightened of a lot of things in order for them to be able to make this long flight without falling into the ocean, because there was no midair refueling back then. And it was anticipated that they were coming in, but the timing wasn't clear. And so when it was detected that there were a bunch of airplanes approaching, some people thought, oh, it's this flight coming in from the mainland. And indeed it was the Japanese naval air arm attacking. So there should have been a way for these bombers, or at least one of them, to maintain some kind of communication and periodic communication, so that their status and ETA, estimated time of arrival, was known rather than having to be guessed at. And two, and also there was not the greatest of communication between the various branches, the Army and the Navy. There was communication on the ground as the attack was happening was not great. So on the one hand, there were soldiers and sailors trying to mount a defense, but there was really little coordination, and there was no preparation for that, and so the defense was all in all pretty weak, and so as we look at our businesses, the ability to communicate clearly and in a timely manner is critical for our success. And so, there's a lot of popular apps these days, Slack and all these kind of things. It's just assumed that these make communication more timely and clear. I'm not necessarily convinced that that's the case. That technology alone will solve this problem. Technology can help, but communicating clearly is as much a mental function as it is, well, it's not as much, it is a mental function. So to communicate clearly, we first have to have a deep enough understanding of what it is we believe needs to be communicated, and then we need to have the vocabulary with which to communicate it. And those, whether we're talking about technical terms or whether technical terms are getting in the way of clear communication, all of these things need to be understood in our businesses. I deal with a lot of lawyers, and one of the things I find frustrating is that oftentimes even lawyers will use terms that are not at all clear. And so, we'll talk about a petition, but mean a declaration, or a declaration but mean a petition, an ex parte application. We'll talk about waiving the probate referee. No, you can't waive the probate referee. That's automatic. The appointment's automatic, but you can waive the work done by the probate referee, at least in theory. So when I talk with lawyers, I strive to be very precise in the language and vocabulary that I use, to be as clear as possible in what I think needs to be done, or in what I'm planning to do as the administrator. And likewise, no matter what your business is, or what professional practice you're a part of, it's crucial that we develop the proper vocabulary, the ability to communicate clearly and in a timely way, and then have the channels through which to do that. Much of which was lacking at Pearl Harbor and added to the catastrophe. Okay, next is learning from failure to drive long-term success. So this is really the primary one that I mentioned at the beginning, that we can rise, like the proverbial phoenix, from a disaster and go on to longer-term success. That was certainly the case post Pearl Harbor. The United States not only ended up with the Allies victorious in World War II, but the entire world order changed as a result of World War II, and the United States emerged as the most powerful country in the world as a result of World War II. And for decades afterwards, America really propelled growth and development in the world. Now, we started to lose ground in the mid to late 70s, and into the 80s, with stagflation and this kind of economic malaise that we encountered. But eventually that too set the stage for ever greater growth and prosperity. And after the defeat of the Soviet Union and the end of the Cold War, America indeed emerged as the single superpower in the world, a condition that at least nominally exists to this day, although China obviously has risen quite a bit over the last 2 or 3 decades to potentially challenge American dominance. And there are There are other foes that we face: Iran, Russia, North Korea, in a sort of disproportionate warfare that the United States is still struggling to figure out, how we're going to deal with these kinds of geopolitical threats. But nonetheless, the post World War II period has in general been a time of tremendous economic and social progress for the United States, and probably not probably would not have happened had the United States not been engaged in World War II. So, for example, civil rights, especially for Black Americans, took a big leap forward as a result of World War II. It became untenable after the performance of Black Americans in and outside of the military to maintain, for example, a segregated military. The Tuskegee Airmen probably being among, if not the most well-known of performance standard of Black Americans in World War II. This was a group of fighter pilots trained at Tuskegee. That's how they got the name Tuskegee Airmen. And a very short time after they entered combat in the Italian theater, bomber crews were begging to have them be their escorts because they were so highly effective. And that's just one example of the social change that was wrought in the United States as a result of the United States being defeated at Pearl Harbor, entering World War II, and seeing the kind of tectonic shifts that happened in our country after the war ended. Finally, the importance of innovation and modernization. So I talked a little bit about this as well already, but the fact of the matter is, like it or hate it, social media is a fact of life. Large learning models, i.e. AI, is here to stay. The question isn't how do I be successful avoiding them? The question is, how do we be successful with these tools in a way that makes them effective for our businesses, but avoids as much as possible the downside of being involved in these kind of things. And the fact of the matter is, the United States, especially the United States Navy, was not well served by this controversy between the admirals supporting the old style capital ship Navy and the admirals supporting the new air-based Navy, if you will. This is something that should have been decided before Pearl Harbor. It shouldn't have taken a disaster like Pearl Harbor for the United States to recognize the importance of aircraft carriers and have had the success of the United States Navy hang upon the carriers just not happening to be in Pearl Harbor. Dumb luck, really, when the Japanese attacked. So these are the kind of things that we need to be examining. Technological change, we need to be examining social change and determining how are these things, economic changes as well, how are these things going to affect our businesses? How do we innovate and modernize our businesses in order to keep up with change? And so these are the lessons that can be learned from defeat. And I want to go back and stress the first lesson I mentioned, which is defeat does not have to put us out of the game. Now, it does sometimes put businesses out of the game, unfortunately, but it doesn't have to. So we can shrink down and grow again. IBM is the perfect example. IBM was the dominant computer manufacturer of its day. And with the advent of personal computers, IBM could have failed and gone away. Instead, IBM shrunk significantly, reinvented itself, and has gone on to great success. as more of a computer services company than a computer hardware company. So we don't need to, defeats small or large don't need force us out of our businesses and professional practices. They are a challenge to us to reevaluate, reinvigorate for greater success in the future. And that, I hope, is the lesson you'll take away from today's show. Okay, we can be defeated, but we don't have to lose the war, as was the case. We were defeated in Pearl Harbor, but we ended up winning World War II, and we, meaning the United States, going on to greater and greater victories. So that's my message for you today. I thank you very much for joining me. Again, I've got my cadre of live viewers. Always grateful to have you watching. I appreciate it very, very much. A little reminder, if you have thoughts, comments, questions, you can always drop them into the chat on the various social media from which you're watching. They all aggregate here on the right side of my screen, and I'm happy to address them while the show is going on. I that's why you see me periodically sort of glancing real quickly over to the side. It's to see if there's any messages there that I need to respond to. So tomorrow at 10 a.m. Pacific time is my show, People Making Money. And being that we're heading into we are in the last month of the year, it's time to start thinking about setting goals and objectives for next year. So I'm going to be talking about advanced goal setting. So this is going to go beyond the typical, develop SMART goals, blah, 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 and get into some very deep issues of goal setting to really set us up for achieving the kind of life that we want to live, not just business-wise and professionally, although certainly in that area, but through all the aspects of our lives. So I'll be talking about that tomorrow, 10 a.m. Pacific time. And then on Thursday at 5 p.m. Pacific time is my every other week show, Jiggers' Place. And I'm going to be talking about the pursuit of beauty. So I think this is probably a more controversial subject than it may seem. And so we're going to sit back and have a cocktail. I developed a cocktail with the help of ChatGPT called a Blossom Elixir. I don't know how it's going to be because I haven't made it yet. So we'll try it for the first time together. You can always sign up for my email list by going to my website, bemmel.com, scrolling down at the bottom. You sign up for my email list, and you'll get an email with the recipe for the cocktail if you want to make one to have with me while we talk and watch the show. So that's tomorrow, 5 p.m. Pacific time, Jiggers' Place. And then next week on Monday at 10 a.m. is my show, Trust and Estates Weekly. My guest is Kevin Quinn, who is the president of the Independent Trustees Alliance. This is an organization my guest and I yesterday, Kaya and I, talked about a little bit. And for those of you who are interested in growing professionally in in estate planning and the administration of trusts and estates, the ITA is really the place to be. And so please join Kevin and me. It'll be the Kevin and Kevin show as we talk about what the ITA is all about and what it offers. And then 7 days, 1 week from today, I'll be back for the next edition of Business Lessons from the Military. So I thank you very much for joining me, wishing you a wonderful rest of the day, and signing off as I always do. Marie, darling, you are my bell.